The night had been unnervingly quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes the shadows in your room feel alive. Eliza's house sat at the edge of the lane, where the streetlights flickered intermittently, casting uneven patches of gold and black across the walls. She had gone to bed like any other night, humming softly to herself while brushing her hair in the dim light of her bedroom. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the faint scent of rain and something else, something iron-rich and cold. By morning, she was gone. Her bed lay untouched, her favorite book open to a random page, and a strange, folded note rested on her dresser, its jagged symbols inked in an indecipherable script. The doors were locked from the inside, windows shut, and yet, somehow, she had vanished. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones, unsure if they had heard the right thing or imagined it, faint footsteps, a flicker of shadow sliding past the curtains. Her parents called her name until their throats burned, finding only silence in reply. As daylight crept in, the ordinary world seemed to hum obliviously, the streetcars rattling past, children's laughter echoing from the distance, yet inside the house, the air felt thick and restless. Somewhere in the corners of the room, in the spaces between reality and imagination, it was as if Eliza's presence lingered, a weight that could be felt but not touched. And as the first investigators stepped across the threshold, they could not yet know that the night had not ended with her disappearance, that the house, the shadows, and perhaps the town itself held a secret older and darker than anyone dared imagine. The ordinary evening had begun like any other in the small, sleepy town where Eliza lived. The streets were quiet, lined with modest houses whose windows glowed softly against the creeping darkness. Eliza's own home was a modest two-story structure, its front garden meticulously cared for, the faint scent of blooming night jasmine drifting on the cool evening air. She moved through the house with a calm familiarity, performing the small, comforting rituals of her daily life. The kitchen still held the lingering aroma of the dinner she had prepared, a simple meal of roasted vegetables and herbs, which she had eaten alone at the small wooden table by the window. The sound of the wind rustling the leaves outside mingled with the occasional creak of the floorboards, a background of gentle, almost soothing noises that suggested a normal night. Eliza spent the evening in quiet contemplation, wandering from room to room in her loose, comfortable clothes, her hair falling freely over her shoulders. She paused often, glancing at the familiar trinkets and photographs scattered around her home. Each photograph captured a frozen memory, a moment of laughter or simple contentment, and she lingered over them briefly, tracing the contours of faces she loved with her eyes alone. There was a sense of ordinariness to her actions that almost seemed ritualistic, as if the world beyond her walls did not exist and would not intrude. She hummed softly to herself while brushing her hair, the sound faint but steady, filling the quiet spaces of the house with a rhythm both soothing and domestic. Outside, the town seemed to settle into a gentle lull. Streetlights flickered intermittently, casting long, wavering shadows that stretched across the pavements, but nothing moved beneath them. Occasionally, a distant car passed by, its headlights cutting a brief path through the darkness, but the overall sense was one of stillness, of suspended time. Eliza's neighbors went about their own routines, unaware that the night would soon take a sinister turn. Inside her home, there was no indication of the coming disturbance, no hint of the absence that would soon rend the calm fabric of her life. Every detail of her evening, locking the doors, tidying the living room, checking the mail left in the box, spoke of a careful, ordinary existence. She had followed the patterns of her life so precisely that nothing seemed out of place, no warning signals in the air, no unusual sensations to suggest that the night held anything other than its expected quiet. The rhythm of the household continued unbroken, a soft murmur of domestic normality, each action blending seamlessly into the next, until the ordinary evening drew to a close with her moving quietly toward her bedroom, unaware that the night ahead would unravel all that she knew, leaving questions that would stretch far beyond the walls of her home. The disappearance happened without warning, as if the night itself had swallowed her whole. Eliza's bedroom, once filled with the soft glow of her bedside lamp, now seemed impossibly empty. Her bed, neatly made, showed no disturbance beyond the faint indentation where she had lain just hours before. The small belongings she always kept close, her journal, a pair of reading glasses, and the half-finished novel she had been engrossed in, remained exactly where she had left them. The room smelled faintly of iron, a metallic tang that seemed to hang in the air unnaturally, hinting at something unseen and inexplicable. There were no signs of struggle, no forced entry, and yet, somehow, she had vanished as completely as if she had never existed in that space. Her parents discovered her absence at dawn, rising to a quiet house that betrayed no evidence of what had transpired overnight. The door to her room had been locked from the inside, and the windows were firmly shut, yet she was gone. Panic began as the initial disbelief faded, a creeping dread that settled in their chests with every unanswered call of her name. The sense of normalcy that had defined the house just hours before now felt fragile and deceptive. In the stillness of the early morning, it was as though the air itself had shifted, carrying an unsettling weight that pressed upon the walls, the floor, and the very breath of those who searched. Neighbors began to murmur in hushed tones as the news of her disappearance spread, each passing hour amplifying the confusion and fear. Some claimed to have seen nothing unusual, while others remembered fleeting glimpses of movement in the darkness, shadows that didn't belong, a flicker of light against the curtains, but no one had seen anyone enter or leave the house. The absence of evidence became its own mystery, a void that demanded explanation yet refused it, leaving those left behind grasping at speculation and half-formed theories. The room itself seemed almost to mourn her absence, a silent witness to something beyond comprehension. Her belongings, so carefully arranged, now appeared suspended in a frozen moment, the ordinary traces of her life standing in stark contrast to the extraordinary emptiness she left behind. The metallic smell lingered, subtle but persistent, a reminder that her disappearance was neither natural nor explainable by reason alone. The quiet was heavier than before, filled with the sense that something had intruded upon the normal flow of life and had taken her without leaving a trace, leaving behind questions that pressed urgently, insistently, against the fragile walls of reality. No one could explain how she had vanished, and in that absence, a new tension began to pulse through the house, the neighborhood, and the town itself. It was as if the night had closed in on her, leaving only emptiness where certainty once existed, a space in which fear, speculation, and the impossible began to take root and grow, stretching the ordinary into something profoundly unnatural. The first alarm came with a sense of disbelief that quickly twisted into fear. Eliza's parents awoke to an empty room, their calls echoing unanswered through the quiet house. At first, they thought she had simply gone for a walk or been delayed by some ordinary errand, but the air felt wrong, heavy with a tension they could not place. The door to her bedroom was locked from the inside, the key still in its usual hook, and the windows were securely shut, making it impossible for her to have left unnoticed. Their hearts pounded with growing unease as they scanned the room, eyes darting from her neatly made bed to the small desk where her belongings rested. Everything appeared exactly as it should, yet she was gone. On the dresser lay a note, small and folded, as if waiting to be discovered. Its edges were uneven, and the ink was dark, but the markings were not letters or words, they were jagged, cryptic symbols that seemed almost to writhe on the page. Her parents stared at it, unsure whether they should feel fear, confusion, or disbelief. The symbols conveyed nothing familiar, yet the note radiated a strange urgency, as if it held a message meant to be understood but hidden beyond human comprehension. The room felt impossibly still, the kind of silence that presses against the ears and makes every small sound, like the ticking of a clock or the rustle of a curtain, feel magnified, almost accusatory. The neighbor's awareness came slowly, first through the worried knocking of someone who had noticed lights left on all night, then through whispered calls from windows. Some insisted they had seen nothing, while others recalled odd, almost imperceptible movements in the darkness. The lack of tangible evidence only deepened the sense of unease. It was not merely that Eliza had disappeared, it was that she had disappeared from a room sealed against intrusion, leaving behind a note whose meaning defied reason. Fear settled like a thick fog, creeping into every corner of the house, lingering in the hallways, and wrapping itself around the hearts of those who searched. As her parents tried to make sense of the situation, the ordinary rules of reality seemed to falter. They checked locks, windows, even closets and hidden spaces, yet no trace of her emerged. The room, bathed in the dim morning light, refused to offer explanation, its stillness now almost suffocating. Each passing moment brought a heightened awareness of absence, the absence of sound, presence, and clarity. A sense of helplessness began to take hold, accompanied by a growing realization that something entirely beyond their understanding had occurred. The note, the locked door, the untouched belongings, all of it combined into an unbearable puzzle, leaving a profound unease that spread from room to room, from the house into the neighborhood, hinting that the ordinary world had been pierced by something unknowable and dangerous. The arrival of the police brought a sense of both hope and growing dread. Investigators moved through the house with methodical precision, their flashlights cutting through the corners and shadows, illuminating spaces that had seemed innocuous just hours before. They checked every door, window, and hiding place, running their hands along walls and floors in search of any sign that could explain the disappearance. Yet as they examined the room, a chill began to settle over everyone present. There was no evidence of forced entry, no footprints in the dust, no fingerprints outside of the usual traces of daily life. The air itself seemed untouched, as if her absence had erased any sign she had ever existed. Detectives lifted objects carefully, scanning for clues, but found only a faint, unidentifiable smear near the window. Its texture and color defied immediate explanation, neither dirt nor blood, yet its presence suggested some disturbance had occurred in that corner. They took photographs, collected samples, and compared them to known substances, but even the most sophisticated testing yielded nothing conclusive. The household, which had once felt safe and familiar, now seemed transformed into a labyrinth of uncertainty. Each closet, drawer, and shelf became a potential hiding place, and yet, in each one, she was not there. The sense of normalcy that had defined the space had been stripped away, replaced by an almost tangible tension that settled over the walls like a thick fog. Outside, uniformed officers began canvassing the neighborhood, asking questions of neighbors who had been awake during the night. The accounts were inconsistent. Some had noticed nothing, while others remembered fleeting movements, strange glimmers of light, or the brief sound of a floorboard creaking in the darkness. None could confirm anything concrete, leaving investigators with only fragments of perception and suspicion. Every report, no matter how small or vague, seemed to complicate the picture, suggesting that whatever had taken Eliza had left no clear path, no discernible evidence, and no logic that could be traced. As the investigation stretched into the afternoon, the detectives grew increasingly aware of the strangeness surrounding the case. The locked doors, the absence of forced entry, the cryptic note, and the untraceable smear combined into a puzzle that challenged conventional understanding. Each piece, when examined alone, seemed almost trivial, but together they formed a web of impossibility that left even experienced officers uneasy. The house, with its ordinary rooms and familiar corners, had become a silent witness to an event that defied explanation. In every shadow, in the faintest flicker of light, there was the sense that something unseen had intervened, leaving behind an absence far heavier than the presence it had taken, and a mystery that no routine investigation could hope to resolve. As the days passed, whispers began to circulate among the neighbors, a mixture of curiosity and unease that settled over the street like a creeping fog. Some claimed they had seen things during the night of Eliza's disappearance, details that were at once mundane and unnervingly strange. Flickers of light behind drawn curtains, shadows moving against walls where no one should have been, the brief glimpse of a figure slipping past a window. Each account was fragmentary, unreliable, yet collectively they painted a picture of something inexplicable. The stories were hesitant, filled with pauses and qualifiers, as if the witnesses themselves were unsure whether to trust their own eyes. The air of normality that had defined the neighborhood was fraying, leaving behind tension that seemed to seep into the walls and linger in the spaces between houses. Some neighbors swore they had heard faint footsteps or soft whispers, fleeting sounds that dissolved as soon as they tried to locate their source. Others spoke of the wind behaving oddly that night, carrying sounds that were distorted, almost as though the house itself was resonating with a voice that no one could understand. The combination of these reports created an atmosphere thick with suspicion and fear, a sense that something had intruded into the ordinary world and altered it in ways that could not be easily explained. Even those who had not seen or heard anything could feel it, a subtle unease that made the hair on the back of their necks stand on end and made doors seem less secure than they should have been. The investigators began to collect these accounts, noting inconsistencies and patterns alike, but no concrete evidence emerged. Each description of flickering light or moving shadow contradicted the others in small ways, yet the cumulative effect suggested an event far stranger than anyone had initially imagined. The neighborhood, once calm and familiar, now existed in a state of heightened awareness, with every window and doorway scrutinized for signs of intrusion. Children's laughter during the day could not dispel the weight of the night, and ordinary routines felt hollow under the persistent tension that seemed to linger like a shadow over every home. Even the most rational observers began to question what they had seen. A momentary flicker in the corner of the eye could no longer be dismissed as imagination. A strange movement against the curtains could not be easily attributed to wind or light. The reports, though subtle and fragmented, built a collective unease, a growing certainty that the night had been host to something extraordinary and unfathomable. The shadows around Eliza's home, the flickering lights, the fleeting glimpses of movement each contributed to a sense that the ordinary fabric of life had been pierced, and that whatever had taken her had not merely left the house, but had left behind a lingering presence that no one could name or confront. In the midst of the confusion and fear, the investigators discovered a hidden journal tucked behind a loose panel in Eliza's bedroom. Its leather cover was worn and supple, the edges frayed as though it had been handled often but carefully concealed. The pages inside were filled with her handwriting, neat in some places and hurried in others, as if she had been compelled to record her thoughts quickly, unable to fully process the experiences she was trying to capture. The entries began innocuously, recounting the ordinary routines of her days, but as the pages progressed, a subtle tension emerged, a sense of unease that grew with every paragraph. It was in these writings that the first glimpses of her fear became visible, fragments of perception and sensation that she could not fully explain, yet felt compelled to document. The entries were filled with fleeting, almost imperceptible observations, shadows that lingered too long at the edge of her vision, whispers that seemed to come from empty corners, and sudden chills that ran along her spine with no discernible cause. She wrote of feeling watched, though no one was there, and of hearing footsteps that vanished the moment she turned to look. The language was precise yet fragmented, revealing a mind struggling to articulate something profoundly unsettling. As the pages progressed, the tone shifted from tentative curiosity to mounting dread, a record of a reality that was fraying around the edges, intruding into the familiar spaces of her life. Certain passages were more disturbing than others. Eliza described seeing figures, vague, fleeting shapes, that seemed almost human but moved in ways that defied normal motion, twisting and bending as though they existed just beyond the rules of reality. She spoke of whispering voices that did not form words she could understand, but which carried a tone that felt both urgent and menacing. These entries suggested a heightened awareness of forces around her that were invisible to others, as if she had perceived an overlay to the ordinary world, a layer of reality in which something else was moving, watching, and waiting. The journal was not merely a collection of fear, it was also a record of her attempts to make sense of the impossible. She experimented with small rituals, leaving notes, rearranging objects, and recording observations of patterns she perceived in the disturbances around her home. Each entry revealed a careful attention to detail, a desperate attempt to impose logic on chaos, yet the more she wrote, the more apparent it became that the forces she described were indifferent to human understanding. The journal became a chilling map of a mind confronting phenomena that defied explanation, and as investigators pored over its pages, they realized that Eliza had been documenting a reality that was both ordinary and impossibly strange, a warning and a record of a fear that had been building long before she vanished from sight. After the discovery of the journal, the unsettling nature of Eliza's disappearance deepened when strange malfunctions began occurring throughout the house. Lights flickered unpredictably, plunging rooms into sudden darkness for brief, disorienting moments. Electrical appliances switched on or off without explanation, sometimes humming or whirring as though powered by some invisible hand. The investigators noted that these disruptions were concentrated in certain areas: her bedroom, the hallway outside, and the small study where she had spent hours writing in her journal. It was as if the house itself had become unstable, responsive to a presence that could not be explained by ordinary science or reason. Even more disturbing were the distortions captured on the household's digital devices. Security cameras and phones recorded fleeting images that appeared briefly before vanishing without a trace. In these glimpses, a figure resembling Eliza could be seen, but there was something profoundly wrong with it. Her movements were unnaturally rigid or twisted, her features slightly warped as if she existed in two realities at once. The figure would sometimes appear behind a door, in the corner of a hallway, or on the stairs, only to dissolve into static or vanish entirely when approached. Investigators watched these recordings repeatedly, each viewing heightening the sense that they were confronting something that existed on the edge of perception, a presence that followed her familiar form but obeyed none of the rules of the living world. These occurrences unsettled everyone in the household. The atmosphere grew thick with tension, an almost tangible presence that seemed to linger in the corners and under the furniture. Shadows moved in ways that contradicted the light sources, stretching unnaturally and defying logical explanation. The hum of electronics, once mundane and background, took on a new, ominous quality, each flicker and buzz a reminder of forces beyond comprehension. Even the most rational members of the investigative team began to question whether the disturbances were the product of human interference, faulty wiring, or something far more sinister. As the days continued, these phenomena became increasingly erratic and unpredictable. Objects shifted slightly when no one was looking, doors creaked as if pushed by invisible hands, and distant sounds echoed through empty rooms. The recordings hinted at a world that overlapped with the ordinary, a place in which Eliza might still exist but in a form that no one could fully grasp. Every flicker of light, every distorted image, and every unexplained hum served to reinforce the unsettling possibility that her disappearance had not been merely physical. Something had intervened in the very fabric of her surroundings, leaving behind a trace of her presence that was at once familiar and utterly alien, as though the house itself had become a threshold between the known and something beyond human understanding. As the days stretched on, another layer of mystery unfolded when Eliza's phone began to behave in ways that defied logic. Despite being nowhere near the device, texts began to appear, sent from her own number, their content cryptic and unsettling. Friends and family received short, fragmented messages filled with riddles, coordinates, and warnings that seemed deliberately designed to be partially understood. The words carried a strange urgency, a tension that suggested danger but offered no clarity. Each message hinted at knowledge only Eliza could possess, as if she were reaching out from a place beyond ordinary perception, trying to communicate through the very technology that had once been so mundane. The messages arrived at irregular intervals, often in the dead of night when the world was asleep and the town streets lay silent. They began innocuously, with simple questions or vague references to locations she had visited. Soon, however, the content became increasingly unsettling. Coordinates led recipients to abandoned corners of the neighborhood, overgrown lots, and long-forgotten pathways where the air seemed heavier, the shadows darker. Some of the messages contained warnings about watching eyes, unseen movements, or the need to avoid certain places, hinting at threats that were impossible to identify but unmistakably real. Those who followed the instructions found nothing tangible, yet the sensations of being observed or followed persisted, a lingering unease that mirrored the tension in Eliza's journal. Her family became obsessed with deciphering the texts, combing through each symbol, number, and word in search of patterns or meaning. Every message seemed to be a piece of a larger puzzle, one that hinted at a reality that intersected with the ordinary world but operated under entirely different rules. Attempts to trace the phone, block numbers, or stop the texts were futile. The messages continued, as if originating from a source beyond human control, responding only to the curiosity and attention of those receiving them. The investigators also became involved, analyzing the messages for forensic clues, but found none. The technology appeared to operate independently, beyond the reach of any person or device. The effect on the household was profound: sleepless nights, mounting anxiety, and the constant feeling of an invisible presence that seemed to monitor their reactions to each new message. Each text carried with it a blend of familiarity and alienness, a voice that was unmistakably Eliza yet distorted in ways that suggested she was no longer entirely anchored to the world they knew. The phone became a conduit, a bridge between her disappearance and the remaining world, offering fragments of her presence without ever revealing her fully. Every new message was both a clue and a torment, a reminder that she might still exist somewhere, yet in a state incomprehensible to anyone who tried to understand. The house, the journal, and now the phone all seemed to pulse with a hidden logic, a sequence of signs pointing toward a reality that was at once intimate and terrifyingly unknowable, a thread leading into a darkness no one could yet navigate. As investigators and family delved deeper into the mystery, they began to uncover unsettling patterns that suggested Eliza's disappearance was not an isolated event. Old town records, newspaper clippings, and archived police reports revealed that several people had vanished under eerily similar circumstances in the same neighborhood over the past decades. Each disappearance occurred on nights when the streets were calm and the houses locked, often without witnesses or explanations. The details were fragmented, almost folkloric, but the commonalities were impossible to ignore: sudden vanishings from secured homes, faint metallic or chemical odors lingering in empty rooms, and reports of strange lights or fleeting shadows in the vicinity of the missing individuals' residences. The investigators compiled the cases, noting how each one had been treated at the time as isolated or inexplicable events. In the older files, the language used by law enforcement reflected a mix of frustration and disbelief, officers constrained by the absence of evidence and the limits of conventional reasoning. Yet when viewed together, the cases formed a pattern that seemed deliberate, a series of occurrences linked not by motive or perpetrator, but by circumstance and environment. The idea that these were coincidences began to feel implausible, and an unspoken question emerged: was there something about this particular neighborhood, or the night itself, that drew these vanishings into being? Some records contained accounts from neighbors who had claimed to see shadows, lights, or movements that defied explanation. These accounts were often dismissed at the time as imagination or rumor, but they became chillingly significant in the context of Eliza's disappearance. Each fragment of testimony hinted at a presence just beyond comprehension, a force that did not act like a human but moved in and out of the ordinary world with intent and precision. The investigators noted the similarity between these witness reports and the observations made by Eliza's neighbors: flickering lights, strange shadows at windows, and subtle, almost imperceptible sounds that left an impression without explanation. The pattern suggested a quiet persistence, an echo of previous events that had somehow recurred in a consistent, almost ritualistic way. The neighborhood itself seemed to take on a strange character in the records, a place where the normal rules of safety and security appeared to falter. Each new case, each old record, added weight to a growing sense that the disappearances were part of a broader phenomenon, a sequence of events that extended beyond any single person. The ordinary streets, familiar houses, and locked doors were no longer comforting but became markers in a history of inexplicable absences. With each discovery, the line between reality and something far darker began to blur, leaving the investigators and those connected to Eliza to confront the possibility that her disappearance was neither random nor accidental, but the latest link in a chain of unexplainable events stretching back decades. The culmination of clues and cryptic messages eventually led the investigators and Eliza's family to a location that defied conventional logic, a place that seemed to exist both within the familiar geography of the town and simultaneously outside it. Following the coordinates and riddles sent from her phone, they arrived at an abandoned section of the outskirts, where overgrown pathways twisted in ways that felt unnatural and impossible. The air here carried a chill that was sharper than the night wind, dense and heavy, and the shadows clung to the corners as if aware of their every movement. It was a place that felt suspended in time, disconnected from the ordinary rhythm of the world, yet eerily tethered to the streets they had walked daily without suspicion. Signs of her presence began to emerge in subtle, almost imperceptible forms. Objects appeared slightly shifted, footprints seemed to form and vanish without trace, and the metallic scent that had lingered in her bedroom now permeated the area. Each clue hinted at a reality layered over the ordinary, a dimension where the rules of space, time, and logic were fluid. It was as though Eliza existed somewhere in between these layers, a fragment of consciousness caught at the boundary of the world everyone else inhabited. Attempts to approach or define the space concretely were met with a disorienting sense of movement and distortion, as if the ground beneath their feet was subtly shifting, warping the familiar into the uncanny. The phone messages, journal entries, and previous records of disappearances all converged here, suggesting that this location was part of a recurring phenomenon that had ensnared others before Eliza. The riddles became guides rather than instructions, leading those who sought her to navigate a landscape that resisted understanding. The coordinates, cryptic as they were, aligned with points of historical significance in the town, but overlaid with subtle, imperceptible shifts that made the geography almost dreamlike. Trees, walls, and paths appeared in familiar forms yet slightly altered, a subtle dissonance that made it impossible to distinguish ordinary from extraordinary. Despite the strangeness, the investigators could not ignore the evidence that Eliza might still be alive. The traces she left, from the distorted recordings to the cryptic texts, suggested an awareness and presence that could not be explained by ordinary disappearance. Yet the place itself was alien, a space existing between dimensions, or perhaps between consciousness and reality. Every step into this area heightened the sense that it was governed by unknown forces, a labyrinth of perception and existence in which she had been caught. It was a revelation that both terrified and compelled them, hinting at an answer that was tantalizingly close yet fundamentally beyond comprehension, a space where Eliza's fate and the boundaries of reality itself were intertwined in a way that no one had yet learned to navigate.